Hey, Shalom Akim, Shabbat Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Rakakadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us truth and salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Rukwai, back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to read through, parts of a chapter within the book of Maccabees. And, essentially kind of more focusing on less, not so much on the battle, but so much a little bit more on the decision making and that these two men had made, right? And throughout the story, Judas Maccabees, essentially in the book of Maccabees, had left these two men, particularly in charge, and showing you that, the reason, or not really the reason I should say, but more of their mindset, of what happens when they wanted to do something that was outside of the order that was given to them, right? And essentially understanding and noticing, what happens when, people go out to try and seek their own vainglory, right? So that's really most of the themes that I kind of wanted to touch on in this particular chapter, right? Now, the chapter is kind of long, so I want to be jumping around for little bits and pieces here and there, and kind of wanted to more focus more on these different portions where these men disregarded the order that was put forth by Judas Maccabees. And essentially what they had done was, they had put their whole platoon, or they put the whole campaign, in jeopardy. They put our people in jeopardy. And it shows you that similar mindset in another sense is still the same today, where, men want to seek out essentially vainglory. And what it does is it becomes a more of a detrimental effect, because it then affects, the people who actually listen to them, right? So, I wanted to go through this story. I thought it was a very interesting story, and Lord's will is always, this lesson will be edifying, right? All right, so I want to jump around, because the chapter is quite long, but just hit a couple key points here and there, and then kind of interject and show you the importance, or rather, I should say, yeah, you could say the importance of being considerate, of being essentially, adhering to the order, essentially the importance of even being selfless, right? And that's one of the things that Yahushua really is truly strongly exemplified, right? So this is the book of First Maccabees, chapter 5. I'll start at verse 1, and I'll just jump around, because the chapter is quite long, right? So it says, this is First Maccabees chapter 5, verse 1. And it says, now when the nations round about heard that the altar was built and the sanctuary renewed as before, it displeased them very much. Wherefore they thought to destroy the generation of Jacob that was among them. And thereupon they began to slay and destroy the people. Then Judas fought against the children of Esau in Idumea at Arabatim, because they besieged Gaal. And he gave them a great overthrow and abated their courage and took their spoils, right? So there's a strong conflict, between, our people, the Israelites, during this time, and, you have the Edomites, right? So that perpetual hatred, has never ever actually gone away. So you start to see examples of that playing out here during the time of the Maccabees, during the time of that Greek Empire, right? Because, one of the things about our people is that because they think they live amongst Esau, they think that perpetual hatred has gone away. They think he's more clean cut, but that hatred, that despising, these heathens, they still don't like you Israelites. And that's one of the things that our people don't seem to understand to this day, right? So I want to jump down to verse 9 here. And it says, and then the heathen that were in Galad, which is actually, I'll read it. And it says, and the heathen that were in Galad assembled themselves together against the Israelites that were in their quarters to destroy them, but they fled into the fortress of Darthema and sent letters unto Judas and his brethren, the heathen that were round about us are assembled together against us to destroy us, right? So I wanted to get that word real quick, because I wanted to just look it up real quick what that actually meant. So when I went to Google, right, it says it's actually a version of the word Gilead, right? So let me just go here. So Gilead, it says the land owned by Israel east of the Jordan River, extending from the lower of the Sea of Galilee and northern end of the Dead Sea, and from the Jordan eastward of the desert and plateau of some 2,000 feet elevation. At the same time, Moses and was his rich. It was a lush region with goodly forests, rich grazing lands, and abundant moisture. Right. So, just to show you and get you an understanding of where this is actually taking place. Right. So, when you see that word Galad, there is actually Gilead. I think that's just the Greek version. When I looked it up, it said that's the Greek version of the word here, right? So, continuing on, it says in verse 11, and it says, and they prepared to come to take the fortress whereunto we are fled, Timotheus being captain of the host. Come now, therefore, and deliver us from their hands, and for many of us are slain. Yea, all of our brethren that were in the places of Tobi are put to death, their wives and their children also they have carried away captives, borne away their stuff, and they have destroyed there about 1,000 men. And while these letters were yet reading, behold, there came other messengers from Galilee with their clothes rent, who reported on the wise, and said, they of Ptolemais and of Tyrus and Zidon and all Galilee of the Gentiles all assembled together against us to consume us. So, essentially, our people, they were in a situation where they needed help, right? So this is what Judas puts forth, right? And it says, verse 16, now when Judas and the people heard these words and assembled together a great congregation together to consult what they should do for their brethren that were in trouble, and assaulted them. Then said Judas unto Simon his brother, choose thee out men, and go deliver thy brethren that are in Galilee. For I and Jonathan my brother will go into the country of Galad or Gilead. So he left. Here's the point. This is really the actual main point I wanted to hit for this lesson, right? I'm just kind of reading this to kind of establish what's actually going on, right? So just bear with me on this. But here's really the main point I wanted to hit. This is verse 17. And it says, then said Judas, verse 18. And so he left Joseph, the son of Zacharias, and Azarias, captains over the people with the remnant of the host in Judea, to keep it, unto whom he gave commandment, saying, take ye the charge of this people, and see that ye make not war against the heathen until the time that we come again, right? So he left, okay, don't go out to war with these people, right? Stay in Judea, right? And keep your post, right? So here it says, verse 20, and now Simon were given 3,000 men and to go into Galilee, and unto Judas 8,000 men to the country of Gilead, right? So what I'm going to do, because he goes out and he fights, right? Judas I'm speaking of here, right? And what I want to do, I want to jump across to, after he returns, right? So this is really the portion I really wanted to hit, because this portion of is really of what these men actually do. So keep that in mind of what they did, and keep in mind what Judas actually said, right? So I want to jump across to verse 54, right? So they went up unto Zion with joy and gladness, and where they offered burnt offerings, because not one of them were slain until they had returned in peace, right? So there was a good rescue. And verse 55, it says, now what time as Judas and Jonathan were in the land of Galad or Gilead, and Simon his brother in Galilee of before Ptolemais, Joseph the son of Zacharias, and Azarias, so remember those two captains, like we mentioned earlier, of the garrisons, heard the valiant acts and warlike deeds which they had done. So they heard about the different, heroic behaviors, of Judas, right? Judas most likely, he had a lot more experience, right? So, here's the juicy part, right? So this is verse 57, and he says, and wherefore they said, let us go get us a name, and go fight against the heathen that are round about us, right? So that's their mentality. They want to go, let's go get us a name for ourselves, right? Let's go fight against Esau. Let's go fight against these heathens, man, right? They were full with that zeal, but remember, they didn't have the not. They completely disregarded what Judas actually said, right? So, this is verse 58, and it says, so when they had given charge unto the garrison that was with them, they went toward Jamnia. When they came, Georges, his men out of the city to fight against them. And so it was that Joseph and Azarias were put to flight and pursued unto the borders of Judea, and there were slain that day of the people of Israel about 2,000 men. Thus there was a great overthrow among the children of Israel, because they were not obedient unto Judas and his brethren, but thought to do some valiant act. Verse 62, moreover, these men came not of the seed of those by whose hand deliverance was given unto Israel, right? So instead of actually listening to the proclamation or the order Judas Maccabees had given them essentially to keep their post, right, and to stay in Judea, right? Let me just double check. Right, with Judea, right? They decided, okay, let us go and do and perform some valiant act, right? Let's go get us a name for ourselves, right? So instead of actually thinking about, because this is in the midst of war, right? They're in the midst of war. Instead of actually thinking about the collective, they're thinking about, oh, let's go and get a name for ourselves, right? So what I wanted to do, I wanted to just pause real quick. Let me go. I wanted to read a couple precepts, actually. Okay, this is Philippians chapter 2, verse 3 in the AMP, and it says, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, through factional motives or strife, but with an attitude of humility, being neither arrogant nor self-righteous. Regard others as more important as yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others, right? So, their mindset wasn't the mindset to actually maintain the welfare of their own people, right? Because they kind of saw it as, Judas was out there performing these valiant acts, Judas is out there, he's defending the people. Judas is out there, committing great slaughter. He's fighting for our nation and fighting for our laws and so on and so forth. He's putting his life on the line, right? Right. So just to kind of get the mentality of the young men here, where they thought to themselves, hearing those things, it kind of irked them in the spirit, because they're like, now, okay, we want to go out and fight there too. But they didn't understand the value of actually keeping their own charge, right, performing their own duty, right, to be able to maintain the welfare of their people, as opposed to their mindset was, we want to go out and make a name for ourselves. And look what happens. It ended up costing them, how do you call that, casualties. Like they say that in war, you have casualties when people die, because the campaign that was launched, I'm sorry, was not very successful, because you had some guy, he left his post, right? So it shows you, and this is in the midst of actual war, right? So how much more serious was that, for somebody to do that, because they wanted to be selfish as opposed to selfless. And Yahushua strongly exemplified an attitude of being selfless, because you're kind of forced, and you're more to actually be considerate to the essentially the welfare of others, right? To the welfare of the body, to the welfare of brothers, to the welfare of, even like your own, like immediate family, believers, so on and so forth, right? Because, you don't want, you strive to actually be considerate, right? And that is something Yahushua strongly exemplified, right? Not to, to essentially to deny yourself, right? Not to, want your own self glory, right? And that is a sort of mentality that that's within our people, I should say, in Israel, right? When you have, for example, and I want to equate this, to a certain, people, like, for example, like you have the captain, to Azarias, and you have the high priest Ari, not what's this guy's name again? Chief high priest. Goodness, the guy from Sakari. Brothers know who I'm talking about. That guy. Pegasus. That's the best name I can remember him as. Anyways, they have these lofty titles, yet for all, they want to strive for the clicks. They want to strive for views. They want to go on do debates. They want that, essentially they want that, that they're chasing after that vainglory, rather than actually being considerate, as opposed, to what they actually say. They don't think about the welfare of their congregation. They don't think about the welfare of, with the things they say. For example, it could be about John the Baptist. It could be about Paul's writings. It could be about the importance of mercy. All these things that they say, they don't actually, take into consideration the welfare of their congregation, the welfare of the flock. They think about, their own. They're just thinking about their own selves and what they, because the knowledge essentially has puffed them up, right? I'm kind of equating and making, multiple points, using these men here as an example in Maccabees, how much the detrimental effects of what has happened, because they ignored Judas's proclamation, and they've decided to try and strive and get their own vainglory, right? This flesh, constantly, wants, the praise of man, right? Right, but through time and time again, you see that the praise of man is extremely it's fickle, right? So let me get Romans. This is Romans chapter 15, verse 4. And it says, "For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, and that we, through patience and comfort of the scriptures, might have hope." Right? So, this is the importance of, these particular stories, looking at the mistakes and the pitfalls of certain men and their decision making, and essentially to be able to kind of revamp and remodel our situation so we can walk accordingly, right? Because you start to see the detrimental effects of what happened when these two men, disregarded an order, and essentially, you know they wanted to strive and get their own name and make an own name for themselves, and perform the duties of Judas Maccabees, right? And another portion of it, you can say also, is that their mindset, not only did they disregard the welfare of their own people they were supposed to keep charge over, they wanted, the they were trying, they're more like comparing themselves to Judas, right? Because Judas is in a situation where, okay, he's on like the front of the lines and he's fighting and so on and so forth. But when you go through certain accounts, I'll use David as an example, because I was meditating on this. David, he was put in a situation because he had that experience, prior to him going up against Goliath. Like, so he had experiences where, okay, before he goes up against Goliath, they were, he was in a situation where he wrestled like, bears and lions. As a matter of fact, let me just find out real quick, just to kind of prove that point. Just bear with me 1 second. Lions. Okay, this is First Samuel 17, verse okay, hold on. Okay, this is verse 34, and it says, "David said to Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock, and I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew them. Thy servant slew both a lion and a bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing that he hath defied the armies of the living power." Right. So, I'm reading this to kind of show that, David was in a situation where, it essentially, all these little mini battles, you can say, it prepped him for going up against Goliath, right? So, these men looking at Judas and looking at his valiant acts, because Judas had experience. That's the point, I wanted to make. Judas had the experience, of all those different situations before, to be able to handle these situations. And these young men are just looking at him like, yo, I want to be able to go make an own name for themselves. But look, if they were in that situation, and look what happens when they went into that situation. And it destroyed them. It destroyed their not just their own welfare, but the welfare of, other Israelites, right? So you start to see that, they were overconfident. That's one of my precepts real quick. Hold on. This is Sirach 32 verse 21. Um in the GNT, and it says, "Don't be too sure of yourself, even when it looks easy." Right. So in the KJV, it says, let me just read it. It says, "Be not confident in a plain way," right? So, they were essentially too sure of themselves, right? So they were looking at Judas and his valiant acts and hearing about it, you know, and they wanting to make an own name for themselves, but still at the same time, the point really is that, they didn't participate in the necessary experience and to go through those same channels that Judas went through to be able to handle those situations, as opposed to them actually trying to do what Judas did, and then it ended up destroying them, right? So, that's pretty much the point. I kind of wanted to hit a couple points here in regards to like vainglory. You start to see the importance, of obedience. You see the importance of not doing too, not essentially not trying to do too much, right? And comparing yourselves essentially amongst, another person, right? Because there's a bit of comparison there also, right? So that's pretty much the point, I wanted to hit, with these two men, that they wanted to go out and make a name for themselves and ended up destroying themselves and their situation, right? And the putting the lives of other Israelites in jeopardy, right? So anyways, I'll leave the lesson there, but Lord's will, this was edifying. And just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. Until next time, I say Shalom.